We're let's try things because yesterday didn't work at first.
Make sure that
Yes. Okay.
thank you very much.
Salvo, salvo. Bueno, bueno, compartir. ¿Estás de cumpleaños? No, no,
¿Vos comes galletas de chocolate?
comer.
One minute.
No, me lo complico con
Yo pensaba que yo era. Oye, fue una maravilla.
Dos. Más oscuro. Y el latte So I think we can start now. We're super happy to have today Mariacristina De Nardi. Thanks for your visit, Mariacristina. An hour and a half.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthias, for organizing a wonderful visit. I'm enjoying it here. And thank you everyone for coming to the seminar. This is about saving and labor supply over the life cycle. And it is joint work with Margherita Borella and Feng Yang and Joanna Torres Chain, who was here before coming to Minnesota and is now a graduate student there. So this part, very preliminary and incomplete, is very important. It's only the second time I present this paper, and we are still working on it and digesting the results. So on the plus side, they are all comments will be new. On the negative side, it will not be polished and clean as when it's a more mature paper. So why people work and save over the life cycle? It's an important question because, of course, why people do what they do is very important to understand the results of any policy changes or reaction to fluctuations and so on and so forth. And there is a lot of literature on it. And let me give you some highlights about this literature. So bequest motives have been mentioned as an important driver of wealth accumulation, starting all the controversy in the 80s between Kotlikov and Summers and Modigliani. They were using flows, capitalizing flows, using this kind of data, and the bounds were 20% is inherited or 80% is inherited. If you look at the stock of wealth today, the question was how much has it been saved by people who are alive today and how much it has been inherited. And so huge bounds. So the first papers were just using data, and the most two recent papers, they were also using models. This wasn't quite the key focus of this paper. And this one only had people 70 and older, right? We tried to do something very well for a much smaller group of people. So I would say we still don't have a good answer to this question. The second factor that has been studied is earnings fluctuates. And people facing complete markets, and so they save to smooth these fluctuations. So part of the wealth that we observe today is accumulated for precautionary purposes, so that we can smooth consumption over time. So here there is also a large literature. It's probably the largest. These are only some citations. The famous Ayagari paper, infinitely lived agent, and exogenous labor supply, so earnings fluctuations. And the idea is that because these earnings fluctuate, they account for 5 to 14% of total wealth that we have at the economy at a point in time. But then we moved on to life cycle models, right? And they are, in Burinchas and Parker, probably the largest number, 60 to 70% of wealth up to retirement time. They don't study the retirement period. Is due to precautionary savings to smooth out earnings fluctuations. KJT uses 50%. So, here we want to think about wealth and earnings, right? So there is nothing about earnings, about people studying request motives. There is a little more in terms of earnings risk, but it's different questions, right? In these papers, people can adjust their labor supply, and the question is more if there is an earnings shock, to what extent do hours fluctuate, right? So it's not the same question of trying to think about what builds up the big macro aggregates of wealth and earnings. And something that is more recent, but we have also discussed as being important, all of these papers are on the US. Okay? So even in the US, medical expenses, we have Medicaid, we have Medicare, we have private insurance, but still people end up having to pay for a portion of their medical goods and services, especially when they are old and they need a nursing home, some specialized care that is very expensive. So this most recent literature finds that from 3 to 13% of wealth, so this is overall of the life cycle, and these two are only for retirement, is due to the fact that people have another source of shocks. Here you have earnings or wage risk. Here you have medical expenses that you can think affect your available resources. Okay, and so that's another reason why people might want to work and save. So another important force is that, we have love shocks, right? People meet someone they like, they get married, or maybe they don't like their spouse very much anymore, and they divorce. And, these events are important because marriage is not only a matter of love, but you have a partner who could work and provide an income when your wage is low, or could provide extra risk for medical expenses. And you have economies of scale, right? So usually, being married is a good engine of insurance, all considered. And when you get married, you have the other partner. And then when you divorce, there is a split of assets. There is a loss in the economies of scale. So this is another very important element that only one paper that I know of has studied. Of course, Victor is always a visionary, right? And he had a simpler model of men and women getting married and divorced. And, really married and divorced was the only uncertainty in this economy, right? Everyone had the same earnings over time and so on and so forth. But in his paper, he studied what if people marry later, what if they divorce earlier, right? And he showed that this is an important reason why people save. Right? So far, we have a lot of papers, but some focus on the working period, some focus on the life cycle, some focus on wealth, some focus on how hours respond. They have one or two risks, right? So what we...
do you have a sense of how these motivations vary geographically? Like say, for instance, expenses for US citizens and European.
I think this is a super interesting question. Different countries have different institutions and different risks. So clearly, in Denmark or in the Netherlands, there is less. Although, nowadays medical expenses are becoming so large that many countries are reducing coverage. So it's becoming more of a risk. But generally speaking, I think it's very interesting to analyze these questions across other countries and see, okay, so if we have the same model and we just change the specifics of the country, what do we learn? So what we want to do in this paper is we want a much richer quantitative model that has all of these forces and has all of the life cycle. So we want to have that people can adjust, right? Because how you face a wage risk, but you can work more hours, or you can work 2 jobs, or you can work less. Already adjusting hours is a way to self-insure. There isn't only savings. We also want the medical expenses, at least during retirement, when they are more likely, right? That there will be a complexity of being able to solve this model. So I will try to make it rich, but I will also need to abstract, for instance, for medical expenses before retirement. I want the entire life cycle. And then, the other papers were having one of these things, but I also want some really novel elements, right? So this isn't the Bedouin rule. I also want to respect the fact that many people are couples and many people are singles, and there are lots of transitions across these 2 states. And in terms of bequest motives, this is also where the model makes there is a doing things better and there is doing more things, right? Where we do more things is that typically when people think of bequest, there is a single person and they die and they leave an estate, right? But in the data, in another paper, we have shown that when there is a couple and the first one dies, there is a significant distribution of the bequests to other people than the spouse, right? And notice, this is another difference across countries. In the United States, there are no legal requirements that you are forced, in Italy, we have the legitimate, right? You have to leave at least 1/3 of your estate to your spouse and children, right? So in the United States, there are no such constraints. So this side bequest, meaning the spouse dies and the remaining spouse inherits something, and the side bequests are what go to children, charities, friends, other countries. They are in 30% of the cases in which a couple dies, and they are 42% of the estate, so they are large.
Question.
Yes.
Why just medical expenses during retirement and not retirement?
Feasibility. We will, when you have couples, you have the state variable, we are going to solve a structural model. You're going to have the state variables of both spouses, which automatic, and so you're going to have the wages, you're going to have the human capital. If you also add the health, which is important driver, it's currently unfeasible for us. Also, the bigger part of medical expenses are nursing homes.
Okay.
And they happen after age 75. So, we are ignoring some smaller, I would say, when you are young, the chances that you get a medical expense shock are much lower. Of course, conditional on getting it, it could be very large because it could be a disability shock. Right? So we are ignoring disability before retirement. I should say this is the main thing that we ignore. So because I want to focus on the entire life cycle, this is going to drive the fact that I'm going to take the data very seriously, and I want my model to match the data. So ideally, we would like to take the young people, because the young people are our future, and we would like to see, with the young court. But if I have a young court, I don't know what they are going to do, right? And especially female labor supply is changing a lot. Everything is changing. So in this paper, we take a court that was born in 1943. So it's not going to look like one of the young courts, but I have a lot of data, including on the retirement savings, right? In another paper, we could take this court and change some things like, the probability of marriage and divorce and use the one of the younger courts, and then use it to try to say something about younger courts. But I think it's difficult to extrapolate because things have been changing across courts a lot.
Christina, just a quick question. Do you consider the decision of having children? Because
Children will be exogenous.
will be exogenous. Because
Yes.
you could think that endogenous you could have more so they take care of you in the future, and so you will spend less on medical expenditures. So like reducing the savings that you want,
I have children, I can tell you they will not take care of me. I think this is probably a feature that is more prevalent in countries that are not as well developed.
Like Malthushan kind of thing.
In countries where there is, I wrote a paper years ago with Larry Jones and Michele Boldrin on the fact that old age social security replaces having children, right? And so I think this is interesting, but it's less important for a country like the US, where there are already a lot of meds and the kids, they have to have their own jobs.
I think US transfer go in the other direction actually, like
Parents to
transfer.
children, especially
children.
because education is so expensive. Okay, so I'm going to use a survey panel data on household surveys that are very good data for the United States. The panel study of income dynamics, it covers the whole life cycle. And the health and retirement study starts at age 50, but that means that on people who are retired, I have a ton of data because there are many people who are sampled after 50, so I want to use both. So let me motivate. So the model is going to be very rich. So I want to explain why you should go through the pain of seeing all of this richness and these equations, okay? I think, when you have a model, you should at least explain why you have the main features that are in your model. It's going to be a standard life cycle model. There will be wage risks, but let me motivate the newer features of this model. So in macro, what do? We often take this household and there is a labor supply and there is a saving decision in the household. But most people are not in a household where there is one worker. Right? Most people are in couples, and nowadays, two people in a couple can work at least for parts of life. In our 1943 birth court, at age 26, over 87% of them were already married. Okay? And in addition, everything I'm going to say about is about this court, but we can then talk at some point about newer courts, how are they different, what do they look like? I think these are all interesting questions, but I'm trying to do things well on a court over which I have a lot of data, and then in the future we can try to extrapolate. Okay? So divorces and new marriages in this court for the United States are common until at least age 60. And then things seem to settle down until people start dying. But anyway, maybe, hopefully we're all economists and we are used to this kind of language. We don't worry about feelings too much, so except for the love shots. At age 26, so for those who are not married, the probability of getting married over the next 2 years is 31%. Right? So it's high. But also, at the same age, if you're married, the probability of getting divorced over the next 2 years is 7%. So that is also large. So you can already see that these transitions across family statuses are frequent. Okay? Not only many people are in couples, but they behave very differently. And I think it's important that we understand why. So let me show you what they do. So here, let me take our cohort, and here we have from age 26 when they enter our model. So we want them to have finished their education and work. So we'll take those initial decisions as given and reflected in wages. Until age 66 when they retire. So both graphs have this age span. And here I'm showing you participation. So how many bodies are actually working? And here we have, for instance, married women. So at every age, I pick the married women and I compute how many are participating in the labor market. Then we have the single women, the married men, and the single men. So what you see here is that for this cohort, married women, about 57% of them were participating at age 26. The rest were working at home. And then as kids age, it's little kids, many of you are familiar how much work they require. They participate more, going up to 87%, and then it goes down. Single women, they are participating much more, and their profile is flatter. So if you're curious and you want to know what happened to younger cohorts, there is less of this, right? So there is much less of a non-participation when the women had younger children. So not only the profile has shifted a bit up, but especially this part has changed a lot. Okay. And then we have the participation of single men and the participation of married men, basically when they are young. All men in this cohort were participating in the labor market, and then they smoothly go down with age, faster for the single people.
So just to understand, and these are people that
At every point in time, I take someone a married woman.
so it's changing over time.
And I have something to say about that.
Okay.
Yes. So here I want to say, okay, so let's pick people who participate. Conditional on participation, how many average hours they work. Okay. So what you see here we have the married women, and you see that married women not only are much less likely to participate, but conditional on working, they work much fewer hours, right? So 2,000 hours is 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. Okay. And so married women work about 1,300, and then there is a similar pattern as the kids are in school, they are in daycare, they can work more. Single women are in between, and then we have the married men and the single men. Okay, so already a very good point.
Do you have data if couples retire together, maybe they enjoy to spend time together?
Yes, about almost half of the couples retire within 2 years from each other. So there is significant joint retirement. And in fact, in our model, to keep things, we have endogenous retirement. To keep things simple, we assume that the couple retires together, which is a simplification, but is not.
One question. How did you explain the gap between single men and single women in the average hours?
Single men in this cohort, they have no children, while single women do, not as many as married women. They also have higher wages and higher human capital. So, but part of the model, so a very good question, because these and the two graphs that I'm going to show you in the next slide are the moment conditions our model is asked to match, right? So our model will be asked to explain participation, labor market participation for our 4 groups overall of the working period, hours conditional participation, and then the next graphs will be about 12, right? And so our model will take a stand about why people do what they do. But there was another question. So the profiles by group reflect that not only do things differently because I'm a single woman instead of a married woman, but there is also that they are different, right? Because first of all, the people who are married and single at 26, for instance, single women tend to have lower wages and lower human capital. But then those with higher wages and high human capital are more likely to marry and less likely to divorce, right? So these profiles reflect both differences in behavior and changes in the composition of the groups. Some people will start here and then they will go here and vice versa, right? And so this is why the model is going to have richness. Not only people will start at 26 with the marital composition that they do, but they will also have probabilities of marrying and divorcing that depends on their gender, on their age, and their wage. And we are going to estimate them from the data. So the model will have this heterogeneity that is built in, and that's why we will have this richness in the model, which some would call complication. I prefer to use the word richness. So this is wealth. Okay, so the difference is that we go from age 26 to age, we plot up to age 85. The model actually gets to age 100, but there isn't a lot of data, so we match the data up to age 86. So you have median wealth and average wealth. We can, because these are the targets moments we will use, but let's focus on understanding this. Okay. So this is median household wealth for couples, right? When a household is together, I observe a total asset of married men and women. And then you have the single men and the single women. So some things are interesting to notice already. So first of all, couples are more than twice wealthier than the singles, despite the fact that they can use the same kitchen, right? We don't need two kitchens. There are economies of scale from being in a couple, so they are richer. Single men are slightly wealthier than single women. The other interesting thing is, remember your friend, the standard life cycle model? Your best friend, the standard life cycle model, tells you that people accumulate wealth up to retirement and then they decumulate because social security or pensions are smaller than income. So do you see any evidence of accumulation here? Right. So here it's interesting that, so first of all, why might people not decumulate? Well, because motives, right? They might want leave resources to other people. They might have expensive medical expenses. If you survive to age 85 and then you need 5 years or 6 years in a nursing home, that's at least $100,000 a year. Okay, but there is also something very important. Not only people are couples and singles and they divorce and they marry when they are young, but here there is a mortality bias. In the United States and in many countries as well, people with higher wages and higher human capital are more likely to survive, right? So after age 66, when mortality still start kicking in, what you have is that this is a selected sample of couples who made it couples together to later ages. And these are also a selected group. They include the people who were alive here and made it to here, but they also include the people who got widowed or widowers, right? And you see how much richer the couples are. So if one of the two dies, the new widows and widowers will also help make the existing singles wealthy, right? So let me finish this. So here, like in the previous slide, you're going to have that people behave differently because their situation is different, but they also are heterogeneous across groups. And in particular, besides marriage and divorce, now the probability that people are still alive here is selected depending on their economic resources. And we want a rich model that captures both. And how we are going to do it is that we want that mortality is a function of your human capital. Okay? Questions?
So before what you said, I was thinking that the life expectancy at the 1943 was constant over the time, but if I understand well, it's not the case. So it changed year by year or not.
Okay, so this is the same cohort of people, right? So younger cohorts have a different life expectancy. So here, you start at age 20. Well, I'm going to assume people don't die until age 66 for simplicity. At age 66, people will have an heterogeneous life expectancy that depends on their gender, marital status, health, and human capital. As they age, their health changes because it's stochastic. So their expectation of living on might change because you have been always healthy, but all of a sudden you get a bad shock. So yes, there will be that kind of evolution too.
So I have two questions. One is how do you think that couples are more likely to be college educated? So part of this different come from
Yeah.
different income. And the other one is which fraction of that wealth is the house, in the sense that all people seems that they don't want to leave the house, but they have very little liquid asset basically.
Yes. So when our people enter the model at age 26, they will have a wage and a human capital that we estimate from the data. Right? So the wage is going to be implicitly recovering the education level that they have to the extent that it reflects in wages and human capital. So, and that's part of the reason why people at 26 will be different, right? The question was what is different between couples and singles. The singles will have their own distribution, and then there will be also wealth, right? So when people enter our model, the singles, they give their own wage, their own human capital, their own wealth that we take from the data, single men and single women. For couples, we are going to have two wages, one for each spouse, two human capitals, one for each spouse, and then the wealth of the couple. Okay. In terms of the second question, which was housing, in the United States, housing is, we are going to just use wealth as net worth. In the United States, I would say, yes, housing is illiquid in the short term, but there are lots of ways, our model period will be 2 years. So you can take a reverse mortgage. You can sell your house, for instance, when people get sick, it's frequent that they sell their house in old age. So we are abstracting from liquidation costs, right? What I would say is I'm not so worried about the liquidity because the model period is 2 years. But, to the extent that you buy houses and then it's costly to liquidate, that's what we ignore.
So if you consider that people leave bequest because they want to, it might be the case that married couples have more children and they want to leave more bequests to their children. That could also account for some of the risk.
That is a common myth that people tend to think that children matter for bequest motives. They don't. Meaning we have a lot of papers that look at people with and without children, people with more or fewer children. Maybe because raising children is expensive, and by the time you leave a bequest, you have already expended a lot of resources, at least in the US, raising the children and paying for their education. But for instance, there is no difference in the accumulation profiles of people with and without children or depending on the number of children. So we will model bequest motives, but they will not depend on the number of children because we don't find this in the data.
Is there substantial difference in the savings rate of single men and single women? And that's because that graph has their assets quite close, and I would have thought their earnings were a bit further apart. And so
well, the model has implications because we are going to have the right earnings and we are going to have the right, which are the previous two graphs, and we are going to, I never particularly looked at their saving rate, but we could. I think it's an interesting, where the model is rich.
Because I mean, in the model, they're going to live longer, and I don't know, their health medical expenses are higher or lower. But...
Yeah, we can look at that. Okay. So this is to show you the data, show you what we will ask the model to match, and also motivate why we will have some of the richness that you will see. So we have talked about couples and singles. The other motivation of the model that I would like to make, I said a little bit, but why bequest motives? And in particular, why studying bequest when the first spouse dies in a couple? I briefly mentioned this, but the data from the health and retirement study have a very nice feature. There is the exit interview. When one of the two dies, there is a complete analysis of how the estate was split and who gets it and so on and so forth. So we know that in 30% of the cases when there is a spousal death, there is a distribution of bequest not to the surviving spouse. It can be children, it can be siblings, and we actually know, for instance, people without children, they live with the same frequency and they live, they have the same distribution. They substitute, they give a lot more to charities, they give a lot more to other relatives. And in 43% of the 43% of the estate whenever this happens. So it's not like you give a few bucks just to keep someone happy. This is a large distribution when it happens. And there are only two papers who have studied this. One is ours, which is the structural model of the people over 70, and then there is a recent empirical paper. So we also want a rich model in which couples can choose to leave bequest when the first one dies, not only when the last one dies. Okay, so I'm done motivating the key new parts of the model. I would like to motivate the approach a little more. Many of us are macroeconomists, but I do believe that going, when the Lucas revolution took place, the whole thing was a micro foundation, right? We want an agent that optimizes and generates outcomes, right? This was the whole micro foundation revolution. I think we are now in a situation in which we have a ton of data on the heterogeneity of people, right? So we don't not only want to model behavior, we want to model heterogeneity in behavior, right? And so I think that better understanding groups of people is also going to help better understanding the aggregates. Okay.
So for the results, I think that you have this type of quest. It's just because you want to match the couple that jumps from the.
Yeah, it's going to be important. Yes. So.
That's the main effect.
Because otherwise they are too rich.
Right.
Even if you take out, the model will be very rich. So there will also be the fact that when the period before a death, medical spending jumps. There can be a long hospitalization and so on. Despite this jump, you're not going to be able to match those profiles if you don't have this side bequest. It's going to be an important part of the story.
Because it's risk. Because you decide how much and how much to live.
Right. But I also think you might think, why do people want to do that? Right? I think it's a very natural thing to do because we are two in a couple and we don't know how long we are going to live and we don't know how expensive living is going to be because of these medical nursing home costs. When the first one dies, there is a significant reduction in uncertainty, right? Because all of a sudden, there cannot be that both of us will be alive at age 98 in a nursing home for 10 years, right? So this big reduction in uncertainty when the first one dies can say, okay, so now let's say maybe the wife died first, the one who has the longest and the most expensive in life. And we have a lot of assets. Well, that this is a good time to give to other people because the surviving spouse will not need as much. Okay. So I think it also makes sense to put yourself in the standpoint of the couple and say, well, yes, it would make sense that in some circumstances this happens, but not always. Right.
But then they can consume it. So
yeah.
You're saying that if you are not explaining the model, right? Because I guess you have some preference for.
This would be the model.
But you have some preference of living questions.
Yes.
Right.
I will show you the equations. Okay. So let me tell you a bit about the approach. Then we will go to the model and then the estimation and the counterfactors to go back to the original question why people save and work. So I'm going to have this rich model with the single and married people. Because courts have been changing a lot over time, I don't want to pretend that there is a court that never existed. I'm going to focus on this court. So there will be no general equilibrium and there is no government budget balance, right? So if you wanted to do that, I think the next step is to model more than one court. They are different but alive at the same time, and that's where you can really. So when I talk about the aggregates, it will be the aggregates for this court over their life cycle. So we are going to estimate it using the method of simulated model to match those 4 graphs. So the model will be required to match participation and hours and wealth that you have seen. And then once I have the model match those aspects well, I will use it to say, well, what if there are no bequest models? What if there is no medical expenses? What if earnings are fixed at the same level as age 26, right? I can then use the model and say, well, this is how savings would have looked like without, and that's how I do the decomposition. Okay, so model key features before, I like to start from the big picture before we go, it's like you see how the puzzle looks like, and then you try to put the pieces together. I find it very hard when people start showing the picture of a blue petal. And I don't know if we're going to have a forest or a flower farm or anyway. So the model period will be 2 years, partly because a lot of the data is every 2 years, and that means you have to solve it for fewer periods. There will be a working stage from age 26 to 60. People will be alive for sure. They will face wage shocks. They might marry if they are single, and they might divorce if they are married, and both spouses choose labor participation and hours. So this is an important departure. There are other papers with couples. I don't want to say all, because there is always an exception in life, but all of the papers that I can think of, the husband is a Lucas 3. Right? As a macroeconomist, you would appreciate this means that the husband doesn't decide how much to work. It's an endowment stream, right? But I think that it's important that even though the labor supply elasticity of married men is not very high, it is there. So we are going to allow married men to also choose how much to work.
Marriage and divorce are going to be shocks? Or
Yes, they are exogenous. They are pure love and hate shocks. We are going to estimate them from the data. I mean, it's clear that this is a huge component. To what extent marriage and divorce are elastic to economic incentives is we are assuming they're inelastic. I think love and hate are really strong. Physical attraction are a really strong mechanism, but
there will be some kind of sorting pattern.
Yes, they will be. We will estimate the assortative matching based on what we have in the data. People with higher wages, they will be more likely to marry with people with higher wages. There will be an early retirement stage. I will not tell you much about it because we already have too many value functions, but between age 62, when is early retirement in the United States, and 66, people can choose whether to keep working or retire. After age 66, we force everyone to retire. And that's what we said earlier. I cannot possibly deal with the complication of couples choosing to retire at separate times. So they retire jointly and they choose together. Then there will be a retirement stage that goes from age 66 to 98. There will be health shocks, right? We had this discussion earlier. At age 66, you learn what your health is. It's a function of your gender, your marital status, and your human capital. Right? So if you had a good career, you started out with a good wage, and you had a high lifetime earnings, you're more likely to be healthy and have a long life expectancy. There will be medical expense shocks, and when people might lose their spouse, not because of divorce, but because of death.
Which shocks are, let's say, uncertainty on your future wages or income? Like the uncertainty on your future wage or your future income,
right?
Would it depend on, let's say, on your education or your initial wage?
Let me show you the wage equations, and then I will show you what we assume.
Do you have children in the model?
Yes, they are coming, but they are exogenous. And also, we have a lot of state variables. So the number of children will only depend on the mother's age and the mother's marital status. So all married women of a certain age, they will have 1.7 children, and we will keep track of how it is a typical age structure. How many young children you have, how many children between 5 and 11, and how many you have until 18.
And the health shocks and the medical expense shocks, are they the same? So if you're going to have a bad health shock, you also have.
And now the goal of the game is to tell you more about these elements and then to show you value functions so that you can understand the decision problem. And then, okay, so the wage question. So I is gender, J is marital status, and T is time. Since I only have one chord, time and age is the same thing. Wages are a function of your age and human capital, which I measure as average past earnings. So we run a regression. We have wages for everyone. We regress them on age, human capital, and a bunch of interactions. And then I'm left with the residual. So I'm going to assume that this residual only depends on gender, right? So all of the heterogeneity in education is captured by this profile, right? The wage profile. But the shock that multiplies this profile is only a function of gender.
Question about the data. Because here you only have one cohort. Is it both couples married in the same cohort, or you still see someone like, because you're like, let's say your partner is 2 years younger. Can you see that as well?
Yeah, no, we take people born around 1943.
Okay.
And we have the couples and the singles, and we kick out extreme, like I think if people, the age gap is more than 10 years between spouses, and then we just ignore the age gap in the model.
Okay, but then because you're going to be tracking both spouses, right? So the age and time would not necessarily be the same, right?
Can we defer the question a little bit? Okay, so marriage, the probability of marrying, we estimate that PSD is a function of age, gender, and your wage shock, right? And this is what is going to generate this movement across the groups. We were talking about assortative mating, Matthias. So the probability of meeting a partner with a certain wage shock depends on your own wage shock in a way that we also estimate from the data. Right? And it will be interesting to change all of these things for more recent cohorts, for which we have at least a working period, and see what we get. The probability of divorce is a function of age and the wage shocks of both. And if we have time, so we go until 1, right? I will show you how they look because I think they're interesting. Children, fertility is exogenous, and the number and age structure of the children depends on maternal age and marital status. So that avoids, it's a simple way to model children, but avoids having additional state variables that maybe a married woman has 2 children age 2 and 4 children age 6. We are assuming this. What do children do? They cost time. So married and single women, we have a different time endowment, and I will tell you more about this. And they will also have a different cost of working, and I will be much more precise about this, right? There will be monetary cost of raising children. So the family size affects the consumption equivalence case. And you have to pay for childcare when you have young children if the mother works. Okay, so health. So at age 66, each person learns what is their health status, which will evolve, but they know what it is after age 66. So it can be good, bad, or in a nursing home. Okay? There is a question in the data that asks people, how would you rate your health? And it's a 5-point scale that typically excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor, that people split in 2. right? So they take poor and fair to be bad. And then we also have data on whether people are in a nursing home. So we can construct this variable based on this information. So this will be, we have an initial distribution depending on gender, marital status, and human capital. After that, they will evolve as a Markov chain. And they will be a function of gender, age, health, and human capital, right? So this will generate the evolution of the heterogeneity, the evolution of health. And medical expenses, I will show you the equation, but it's essentially a monetary shock that hits your resources. It will enter the budget constraint. Health will evolve, and survival will also be a function of all these variables, and that's how we generate the composition of those groups in retirement changes as in the data. And this will become even clearer when I show you equations. Okay. Government is there because the government is important, and we are going to estimate all of this from the data, but I'm not going to balance the government budget constraint because it's unclear to what extent this court had to pay for what it received. So in the United States, we tax households, not the individual in a household. There is the marriage bonus, the marriage penalty, all of this is in the model. We have Social Security. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because I have a lot of things to show you. This is just to say we have a very realistic, stylized, but very realistic picture of what the government did for this court. Okay, so final equation. So there will be a discount factor. References will be time separable. There will be a time endowment. So what is the challenge here? We want to explain hours. Guess what? Married women don't work many hours because they take care of the household and the children if they don't work or even if they work. And so this estimating how many hours men and single and married men and women is a way to have home production, right? I take home production out, and there is an available time that people can split for leisure and working, and I'm going to match the data that way. Otherwise, married women would work an insane number of hours because we don't know that they are working in the house. The assumption is that when I do a counterfactual, this remains fixed. People do not adjust. So your leisure at age T, person I, gender and marital status is your time endowment minus how many hours you work. And then if you participate, there is a fixed cost of going into work, right? During COVID, we all learned that the difference between having to shower, put on nice clothes, brush your teeth, take the car or the subway and going into work. You know, in some cases, it might also be you need to get the children ready to work and so on and so forth. But in any case, if you decide to work, you lose a certain number of hours because you have to show up for work. So these are the utility functions. You are a single person, you derive utility from consumption, leisure, and this is how many children you have, which is if you are a single man, it's 0. You derive utility from consumption divided by the family size. And you have a composite good between consumption and leisure, right? We follow the more micro tradition. What will happen in the estimation is that consumption and leisure will be substitutes. And therefore, when people retire, consumption will drop, which is also what happens in the data. And this is how happy they are to be alive. This is because in this model, you understand that if you work longer, you're going to live longer, right? So the effect turns out to be very small, but if you hate being alive, typically this flow is negative, right? We never worry about it because life expectancy is exogenous. But if you hate being alive, you might not want to work because that keeps you alive. So that effect is going to be very small, but there is a constant that you can tack on, and is going to eliminate this. If you are in a couple, you derive utility from common consumption, considering the size of the household. Each derives utility from their leisure, and we adapt.
So children here purely a cost.
Excuse me?
Children are purely costly for?
Yes, children happen. It's a depiction of my household. Children happen exogenously, and they cost time and effort to raise them. Maybe there will be a payoff at some point. Sorry, oh my God, this is recorded.
Cristina, I know in your model, like being single or being a couple is something exogenous, but could it be the case that people that basically decide to be single or decide to be in couples have a different discount factor, and that could basically be driving the accumulation of wealth for these types of agents?
Yeah, that's possible. I don't know how we could possibly handle and identify that. But it is possible that, I mean, I believe that there is preference heterogeneity. And, maybe people who are less patient are less likely to get an education, are less healthy, and they make for less attractive partners on the labor market. So it is possible that this is an additional force that we are ignoring. We are saying, let's look at what we can do and estimate, and let's see if we can explain the data. But, I think it's...
Sorry, one more thing, like here, like the health status of the person is something also exogenous. I mean, yeah, and basically agents cannot make any effort to be better or worse off, and this is because of the state variables problem or something?
Well, I mean, there is a bit of an effect that you understand that a good career and higher human capital makes you healthier and live longer. But it's a small effect. I have a lot of papers where I try to worry about those things, but they're very difficult. We don't know what those elasticities are.
So the economies of the scale of the child are different between couples and singles.
Yes, well, singles, we have a different number of children, but yes, each person in the couple derives utility. We all watch the same TV, we all use the same kitchen. So consumption is a public good up to the economies of scale, and we both derive utility from this consumption.
But for couple, it's less costly to have the child than for single, or not right now?
Well, this only depends on how many children you have. So this is the same. If you have the same number of children, this is the same, but you are adding it up. So we each derive utility from that. Okay, so you think that an hour and a half is so long, but okay, so bequest, okay? So we distinguish when there is no surviving spouse, that's why there is the 0 here, and this is the estate that is left. So this is called a warm glow utility, right? What it means is in this model, you save, right? There is this non-state contingent asset. And when you die, if you have no bequest notice, guess what? That stuff gets left on the table. It's a complete loss to you, right? What this does is that you derive some utility from the fact that this is left. And, it doesn't matter if you have children, how many children you have. You derive utility according to an intensity. And then there is this parameter that is, remember, this is your second best friend, the CRRA utility function. Remember in other conditions. So if kappa is 0, everyone has infinite utility from leaving at least a cent of bequest. Right? So having these parameters allows you to recover the fact that poor people do not leave many bequests because they have to take care of themselves first. Right? So if you want to think, there are people like Abel and Warshawski, micro-funded this, thinking about this can be some average utility of your children. If you think that children matter, this is right. So you can think of micro-funding this as saying, this is a proxy for an exchange motive or altruistic. So it's a very flexible formulation that doesn't really take a stand on why people leave bequest. If there is a spouse, it's the same formulation. I only allow the 2 parameters to be different, and then the estimation will decide if they are or not. Okay, so the last piece to understand the model is I would like to show you some value functions, so I will not show you all of them. because I know there is a limit to human endurance. So I will show you the ones for the working period and the retirement for singles, and the working period and the retirement for couples. The early retirement is not so interesting. They decide whether to claim or not claim Social Security.
But what drive early retirement in the model? Because they don't have health at that point.
No, but they might have a low wage shock. So say that you have always had a very high wage shock, you have accumulated a lot of assets, all of a sudden your wage shock is low, you have this utility of working, and you decide to not work anymore. Okay, so the working age single. So here you start seeing why this is a complex model. So working single, this is their age, gender, this is their wealth. The objects in red are those with which I will do the counterfactuals, right? So they are meant to show you where they are. So this is your wage shock today, and this is your human capital that you accumulated so far. You choose to consume, to save, and hours, which can be zero if you don't participate. This is the utility flow, this period. If you do not marry, which happens with this probability that is heterogeneous, so that discuss that a lot, you move on as being single again, next period, and in the next slide I will have the law of motions, but you will draw a new wage shock and your human capital will update. And this will be your savings next period. If you marry, which happens with a certain probability, you meet a certain partner. Right, this is both the wage of the partner you meet, and then conditional on the wage that we have wealth and human capital. This will be me married with a certain person, right? There is the value functional person who is married in a couple. So what happens when I marry is that we pool the assets. So these are mine, and these are the ones that the partner brings to the table. I add the wage shock of the partner. All of a sudden, I have to keep track of whom I'm married with, and this is the human capital of the partner. But you can already start seeing why, for instance, we don't have health shocks during the working age, because when you have couples, the state variables start really becoming, the state space is very large. So the most interesting is the budget constraint, but it's kind of standard. You consume and you save for next period. You have savings for last period. There is income net of childcare costs if you have children. And then you pay taxes. Where is your income? Maybe this is the only other equation that is interesting here. It depends on your age and human capital, depends on your wage shock, and depends on how many hours you work.
Yes. A question. So the return on assets is exogenous, right?
Yes, and there is only one asset, and it's the same for the same return for everyone.
Right, because I think this government has seen all the savings lot of the rich and all those things, but
yes, we could in a separate paper on the retirees, we had an IID rate of returns, so that we need to keep track of an additional state variable. We only needed to compute an additional expected value. And then we fed the realized rate of returns. We haven't done it in this. For that other paper, it didn't matter so much for the estimation. That
on the role of the requests in wealth accumulation, I feel like there are two possible motives, and you have the one where you want to leave requests, but there's no receiving requests.
That's true. That's something that we haven't done yet. We could have the tractable way of doing it is that there is an extra shock here, and you estimate the function on probability. Yes, completely, I agree. That's on the to-do list. It's just that I published a bunch of papers, and I have no papers to present, and people keep inviting me, and I will to be able to show you some results. So the last few months have been really stressful with all of these seminars lined up and no paper to present.
In the same line, the taxes have changed a lot.
And they do here, right? I didn't tell you, but we estimate, see this T here, we have a separate paper in which we have estimated the tax function for every year. So this court does not face time varying rate of return, but does face the actual taxes that all of the tax returns and all of the changes in the social security that took
There is no acceptance. So I know.
No, I think this is super interesting. We wrote the other paper because we never know how many taxes we are going to pay in the US. First of all, there are reforms, but then the reforms, they have phase-in periods, and then they have phase-out periods. And so I think it would be super interesting to study the effects of this uncertainty and make a stand about what people think about what their tax. I mean, that was the last tax cut. I had no idea how many taxes we were going to pay until we actually filled the tax form. So I think it's a super interesting question. But yes, taxes do change a lot. So let's talk about the retired single. So the last time we presented this, I got 1 minute and I was barely starting to present the results. And this was part of the reason why this was a disaster. So I'm going to try not to make this a mistake again. So this is the retired single, certain age, gender, wealth. The health state appears at 66. This is their human capital because it affects their survival and so on and so forth. This is when they retire because these two affects your social security payment. So you consume and save, you derive utility from consumption, leisure, and so on. And this is where the more standard type of bequest motives takes place, right? So if the person dies, and again, we have this mortality bias, they derive utility from leaving. There is a max here because there are medical expenses at death. Right, so if you leave if your estate is positive, you derive some utility from the fact that the dog, the children, the charity, the church gets it. If the person doesn't die, they move on as a retiree. And the more interesting thing is that that's where the medical expenses kicks in. It's a shock. And even in the United States, we have some floor, right? So this is a government transfer that if your resources get really depleted, you get a minimum amount of consumption that bumps you up. And the consumption floor is going to be important. Working couple, they have the 2 wage shocks and the 2 human capital, right? So there was a question about age. So I'm assuming they are the same age.
Going back to when you showed us the data,
yeah.
Those married couples are in the same year, or you allow some couples to not be born in the same year but still be considered as in the same cohort? Is that close enough?
So I'm trying to listen to your question and to think about what question you might be asking, which is not good. Please say it again.
Yeah. So basically, you said you're just using the cohort born in 1943.
Yeah, but there is a window around it because otherwise we don't have enough for observation. But yes.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. So the couple chooses the hours of both. They can be 0 because there is a participation cost. So if you are a person who has a relatively higher assets, you might choose not to participate if your wage is low, for instance, this period. So if you remain married, you move on with the value function of the couple. If you divorce, you have the separate utility of the two continuing as single, and you split the assets. And each continues with their own human capital and their own wage. There is nothing interesting. The budget constraint, you just up the income of the two. And but let me show you the retired couples, which is when you can see the side bequest. So the retired couple has a certain age, a certain wealth, the health of both, the human capital of both, and when they retired, they choose consumption and savings, and if one of the two dies, decides on side bequest. Okay? They derive utility from this period. If both survive, and again, notice that these are rich functions, they continue on as a retired couple. If one of the two dies, this is where you look at, so this is the expected value of the surviving spouse, starting with some wealth minus the side bequest, right? And this is the utility from that side bequest. So that's how you decide to split. So as we were saying, say that one of the two spouses dies prematurely, that this would be really high compared to the value of leaving a side bequest, and that's when you decide to leave a side bequest. Say that the other spouse, say that we are now 94 and we are both still alive and our wealth is very low, in which case, when the first one dies, you're not going to leave a lot of side bequests, for instance. Okay, and the only difference is that now you have the medical expenses of both people in the couple hitting the constraint. Okay, so I estimate the model with the method of simulated moments to match the 4 graphs that I showed you in the beginning. However, I have lots of parameters, the interest rate, the taxes, and so on. So I try to fix as many as I can without actually solving the model. So I thought I was, so let me show you the probabilities of marriage and divorce, because I made a big deal. So here is what we estimate from the PSID, age 26 to 60. This is the probability of marriage for men. And what you can see is that the probability, remember I told you it was about 30% at age 26. These are different wage shocks. We have 5 possible wage shocks, and what you can see is that the PSID data tells us that this wage shock for men has a large effect on the probability of being married. The higher wage men, so let's look at the gap. We have about 0.27 and 0.47, so a very different probability of marriage depending on how productive you are, at least in this cohort. For women, there is still a bit, but it's much less.
So, but before 26 is not different, because I guess this cohort, at least women, they marry super young. So before 26 is not different.
We start the model at age 26. So we take who is already married, and then we look at what happens after. Sorry.
Just a little confused. Why do you use the wage shock and not the initial human capital?
We tried in a different version. We get very similar results, but rich and complicated go hand in hand, right? So if it's a function of human capital, you understand that it is a function of human capital, and you might work more because you want to increase your probability of marriage. And we wanted to try to, can be very challenging to understand the results of the model. And the more channels you have, the more difficult it is. So the results weren't very different, and we prefer to stick with the case where there was one less feedback to understand.
Okay.
But
this wage shock is something like the actual wage compared to some other. It's
just the residual compared to your typical productivity.
Okay. So it is independent from the human capital?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We in our restart paper we also had this version as a function of human capital. For the purposes of estimating the model, it didn't make any difference, but I have no doubts that for some counterfactuals it could be interesting to look at that. Right, you're right that this introduces a lot of noise in marriage and divorce. Although that shock is very persistent, right? So the persistence of that shock is 0.95. It's an AR1, so maybe not. Yeah. Okay, so this is the probability of divorce. And here for men, by age, you also see that there is a large gap with the more, right? Here is the thicker line, higher wages. So the men with higher wages are less likely to become divorced, and similarly for women, but for women, again, less of an effect. Okay, so in the second step, we have 23 parameters: patience, the weight on leisure, the utility, available time, the fixed cost of working, childcare cost, and bequest, which we use to target those moments that you have seen. So I would like to have some time for the results. So I will tell you that the model did well. I mean, we have about 20 parameters and 344 targets. So not everything is perfect, but it's a very good fit. So let me talk about the results. So let's go back to the original question of what drives savings and earnings. So what I'm going to do, I have estimated the model. And now I'm going to take the estimated model that matches the data for this cohort, and I'm going to kill bequest motives and say what would have savings and labor supply have been if this cohort never cared about leaving bequest. What if there are no medical expenses whatsoever? So imagine this is an extreme case in which all of a sudden we go to a wonderful public system, nobody has to pay anything anymore. What if we shut down wage risk? So everyone keeps the same wage they have at age 26, the same stochastic part of the wage. And what if there is no marriage and divorce? And I think the papers, we have many more things, but this is what hopefully we have the time to talk about today. So I'm then going to compare my benchmark model and my counterfactuals, and I want to do two things. First, I want to understand the heterogeneity. But then I want to sort of become a macroeconomist again, and I'm going to think, because when you look at couples and singles, the weight, right? We were talking with Luciano today, the weight with which you aggregate effects matter, right? So sometimes you look at the effect by groups and you get a very misleading picture because there is a huge effect on one group, but that group is very small, so it doesn't really matter for the aggregate. Right? So that's why I want to both look at groups of households, but also over the lifetime of this cohort in the aggregate, couples and singles together. Okay, so the first counterfactual is the one in which I kill all bequest motives. And I'm going to show you two outcomes. This is my median wealth from age 26 to 98. And you will see two sets of lines. The dashed one is the benchmark model, right? So here, when you look at the two black lines, you see what happens when I eliminate bequest motives to the median wealth of couples. And when you compare these lines, the blue lines is what happens to the median wealth of singles, right? So there was this question that you asked earlier. See how these lines for singles bump up, right? These ones are the new widows and widowers that become single, right? So you asked that question earlier. Anyway, so what you see is that, first of all, couples start saving for precautionary reasons, mainly when they are young, and that's something that Gurinchas and Barker has also described. When people are young, they want to build a buffer to insulate against wage shocks. But then, already starting at around age 40, they are already putting on some savings, not only for life cycle, but also for bequest. And then what you see is that, for instance, at age 80, you go from about $500,000 to about a little over 200, right? So the model is telling you bequest motives for couples are very large. And what you can see is that they also, here, you see that the wealth of singles will be also lower. So this tells you that this is a significant reason for to save.
Are you going to show in the one or just?
No, but it's interesting to see what people are interested in. We have looked at tertiaries for couples and singles, so the effects are larger for a higher wealth people, but they are also there for lower wealth people. So these are earnings, right? This is a summary of what happens to participation, hours, and wages. So the most interesting line is the pink one. So these are earnings of married women. Okay? And what happens is that they drop 2 to 4%. So in this model, the people with the highest labor supply elasticity are the married women, which is consistent with empirical evidence. And this is, and the green line are the married men, right? So this is the zero line. So what you can see is that married women, and to some extent married men, do work a little bit more because they want to leave some bequest. What about the aggregate? So here, I take all of these numbers and I aggregate everyone up using the fraction of people who are single and married and how much wealth they hold. So what you can see is that when I eliminate bequest motives, 26% of the wealth held by this cohort on average is due to bequest motives, right? Remember the original numbers? We were going from 20% to 80% to 15% in the paper in which we only had the retirees. Here, it's a large number, but we are toward the lower end of the estimate, right? I mean, you might think 25% is a lot, but if you compare with the numbers that other people had proposed earlier, it's actually very low. So we have no data from previous work about earnings, right, which is another important aggregate that macroeconomists care about. The effect is overall smaller. Average earnings over the life cycle of this cohort would be 1.4% lower. Not enormous, but not really a little. Okay. So what happens if we eliminate medical expenses? Why do people save and work?
In the previous slide, why do the bequest motives hit harder single men, single women than couples? What showing on in the what?
Those are percentages, right? So here you see, if you look at the amount, there is a much larger drop for couples. Of course, because they are so much richer, the percentage is smaller. For couples, the drop is not as large, but since they are so much poorer to start with, it's not like I can tell you if I change this aspect of the environment, I will get the same percentage. It just happens to be that way. The drop is very large, is a bit larger as a fraction of the resources. I can think more about it, but I don't know the answer to that question right now. So what happens if we completely eliminate medical expenses? Notice this is a really extreme, right? We don't eliminate medical expense risk. We zero out all medical expenses during retirement. So similar type of graph. This is the couple and with medical expenses and without, and these are the singles. So what you can see that this also has a bite. People would save less, and remember, these are medical expenses starting at age 66, right? So people are very forward-looking here. Already around age 50, they know that with or without medical expenses, they need to change their savings. Something interesting happens here, right? You see that they actually save more without medical expenses. Do we have any conjecture as to why?
They bequests and the medical expenses in the last 2 years are just immense.
That is a possible explanation, but it's not why it happens. So we also didn't know which of the two was the explanation. What is going on here is this, as macroeconomists, most of you are familiar with the macro disaster risk, right? The macro disaster risk is something that happens with the low probability, but it's huge, right? Here we have a micro disaster risk when medical expenses are there. It's the probability of living a long time and having a long nursing home stay, right? So this micro disaster risk is very difficult to insure with one asset, right? Because you have to pile up all of these resources for a very low probability event. And then if you die, yes, you have bequest motives, but you would maybe leave less bequest. So in this case, the consumption floor is a strong disincentive to save. It's also, Hubbard, Skinner, and Zedes have these effects. When the consumption floor is based on your resources, It's really a tax on savings. Because if you end up on the consumption floor, they take all of your assets. And so you don't want to accumulate all of these assets in present of tail risk, right? When you eliminate the medical expenses, all of a sudden the micro disaster risk is not so bad because you only have the risk of living long. You don't have this super tail risk, right? So then it's much better to save because you're not as likely to rely on the consumption floor and you want to enjoy your resources because savings is a better tool because you don't have this very difficult to ensure tail risk, right? So that's why when we talked about the consumption floor, I made sure I mentioned it and I said that it's going to be important. And this is something that goes back to the Hubbard Skinners and the papers in the 90s. The consumption floor can be an implicit tax on savings, depending on the risk structure and the asset structure that you have. We also see that it does have an effect on earnings. And again, a similar message, the married women are those with the most elastic labor supply. So if there were no medical expenses, then you are the ones who would work a little less and enjoy more leisure. Some effect also on the married men. So what happens in the aggregate for this court? 9.4% of aggregate wealth is accumulated because people expect these large medical expenses in retirement. And the effect on labor earnings is not zero, but it's much smaller than for bequest motives, right? So we find, what did we have from the previous literature? Much less work than on bequest motives. In our paper about retirement, we find a much smaller effect. But the reason why we find a much smaller effect is that, well, if you are 70 and you start with the given amount of wealth and you eliminate medical expenses, the bequest motives start to become very important and you cannot re-optimize, right? If I know it earlier on, I have many more years not to save, right? So it makes sense that with the whole life cycle, the response is bigger. And this paper, it's interesting. They have the whole life cycle. It's a much more stylized model, but we are in the ballpark. They get 14% and we get 9%. What if we remove both? To what extent do we get our life cycle model back? Right? Remember that so here, if we remove both, you see that this is a really important. These two are really important reasons why people save. You have a drastic change in the wealth of couples and also a drastic change in the wealth of singles. And a very large effect also on earnings, particularly by married women, but also by married men.
So why single women they work more in this world?
Okay.
Line in the second.
Yes, so these are the single women. Let me think.
Is this like composition effect or?
I know it. So
it don't happen when you don't have medical expenses, right?
Yeah. Can we?
Yeah,
can
sure.
I try to? Yeah. I cannot answer it quickly. I need to think about it, but I know that I thought about it. Okay. So in total, 38% of wealth is due to the combination of these two motives, bequest and medical expenses, and almost 2% of earnings. So I have 4 minutes. Previous literature, it wasn't so bad when you combine the two. Okay, so I want to show you 2 more things, the wage risk and the marriage and divorce. So I will have to speed up a little bit. So when I eliminate wage risk, what you see is, early on people save for precautionary savings. If you don't have earnings risk, there is a much larger drop in wealth earlier on. And then eventually people converge because they go back to their original saving motives. So what is going on here is that people save much less when they are young. Okay. And therefore, they have lower asset from income. So at some point, they have to work more if they want to accumulate savings again. In terms of the whole court aggregate, remember the large numbers. We had 5%, that was the lower bound in IAGARI. We had 60 to 70%, 50%, right? So we find that wage risk is a non-trivial determinant of aggregate savings, but once you have a rich model, its role is much smaller. It does have an important effect on earnings, and it goes the opposite direction that you might expect. And it comes from this fact, right? Initially, you work less because you save less, right? But then you have to catch up with the fact that you didn't save, you don't have any savings, and you didn't have any income from savings. So at some point, you have to work more, right? And the net effect from the model is that you need to work more when you're older, and overall, the total earnings goes up over the whole life cycle.
Do you include unemployment?
It's part of our wage shock, right? So, right.
Because it's an annual wage.
Right. Biannual. So, every 2 years we have your earnings, you have your hours, and first of all, if you might be employed for part of the 2 years, and then I have to check whether we include unemployment compensation. I don't remember that.
In some sense, you underestimate the effect, right? Because you're accumulating 2 years. It's like reducing the risk because otherwise you are at a big period without income, and that pretty much.
Yeah, but it's for a much shorter time, so I'm not sure.
Sure.
Okay, so the last counterfactual before I conclude. What happens if people who are married at 26, they stay married forever, and people who are single at 26, they stay single together forever, right? So there is not going to be any uncertainty about your marital status. So couples save a little less. For couples, the risk is getting divorced, right? So now that there is no divorce risk, no loss of economies of scale, we can save a little less. However, for singles, this is terrible news, right? Because they are not going to find someone who also can provide income and also can provide economies of scale. So they now, part of the reason they were not saving was that they were expecting to get married, right? Now that they don't expect to get married, they have to save much more, right? They also, this is the earnings of the single women and single men. Look at to what extent the single women were counting on finding a partner, right? So now they are on their own. Notice they're on their own while they work, and then for retirement, because earlier in the US, you can claim Social Security under the husband's account, even if you never work, right? So there are many reasons why it's advantageous to get married. So now that there is no earnings from the marriage and no spousal benefits from the marriage, they really need to work much more.
Children here stay the same. So.
Children stay the same. So here it's interesting because you have very heterogeneous effects. Couples save a little less. Single people save hugely more, but there aren't that many single people and they aren't that rich, right? So overall, you have a small increase in aggregate savings. So I think it's interesting to understand that heterogeneity. And similarly, married people work a little less because they don't need to save as much, but single people work a lot more, and so you have a smaller aggregate number. So I will not conclude, I will just show you this. So in terms of wealth accumulation, we find that bequest motives is the single largest determinant that we have studied, followed by wage risk, medical expenses, and marriage and divorce. But remember the huge heterogeneity by group here. And in terms of labor earnings, the effects are much smaller, and they are largest and positive for the wage risk, and the second largest for bequest motives and marriage and divorce. So I think I will conclude here. I don't want to, unless you want me to go over the last slide.
Questions?
Thank you. So I'm sure this I
Me encanta, estos pecados. I disagree because it's just before retirement.
I know that I have written explanation because I don't. They work always a little bit, right? So the question is, why do they particularly work? I think that this is the effect of the consumption flow. Without the medical expenses, the consumption flow is not as attractive because it's less likely to right? What I'm trying to square with is that I would, so here we can see very later on they save more, right? So I'm trying to square, so I need to think more about it. Yeah, because what is puzzling is that they save much less for all of the periods, and you would think that by 6 years, why would they say work more for something that happens only for I need to.
And there's not a lot of selection over there, right?
Well, the selection doesn't change when you change the medical expense. It's exactly the same. So this is a behavior. I think I will be more prepared.
Thank you. Very much.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Christina, I was thinking something like very quick, because I mean, it's very cheap to fit the model with the trajectory of the aggregate interest on the bonds or whatever.
Then I would not have rational expectations, right? Which,
Deterministic, but it's for the quantitative.
say people are systematically surprised. No, thank you. I would like to, I haven't had lunch, so I would like to, chocolate lunch, chocolate lunch. We can have a part. So that I
La muñeca juega gracias.
Can